Number 7. John Errol Ferguson. Ferguson was disabled by significant mental illness for more than 40 years. The 65-year-old was found guilty of murdering 8 people, including 2 teenagers, in 2 different incidents in 1977 and 1978 following his release from a state mental hospital. He was found in 1965 to have visual hallucinations and was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. Among other delusions, Ferguson believed he was the Prince of God and was to be seated at the right hand of God after his death. He also believed that he was being executed because he can control the sun, and upon his death would rise up to save Americans from a communist plot. On August 2, 2013, 4 mental health organizations filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court in an effort to stop the execution. Ron Honberg, the Director of Policy and Legal Affairs at the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and one of the amici, said, "The death penalty is not constitutionally allowable as a punishment for John Ferguson because his delusions prevent him from understanding the nature of what is happening to him." The court refused to stay the execution. Ferguson was executed by lethal injection in Florida on August 5, 2013. Number 6. Matthew Reeves. In 1996, Matthew Reeves, his brother Julius, and several others planned to commit a robbery. On the way, their car broke down in Selma, Alabama. Willie Johnson Jr. offered to tow them to Reeves' house with his pickup truck. When they arrived, Johnson was shot through the cab window and robbed. Reeves was arrested first. Julius and another accomplice were arrested a few days later. Both claimed that Reeves was the shooter. Reeves had mental health issues from the age of 8. At 14, testing revealed he had severe deficiencies in nonverbal social intelligence skills and his ability to see consequences. Reeves was diagnosed with an intellectual disability based on testing which showed his IQ was 71, with a 3rd-grade reading level. The state's expert found his IQ was even lower, at 68. The jury did not hear evidence that Reeves' low intellectual functioning made him particularly susceptible to the influence of others. On January 7, 2022, Reeves' execution was stayed when he sued the state, claiming it didn't accommodate his disability when it gave him a form asking him by which method he wished to die. However, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 that the execution could proceed. Stavros Lambrinidis, the EU ambassador, sent a letter condemning Johnson's killing and asking Governor Ivey to block the execution. Nevertheless, Reeves was executed by lethal injection on January 27, 2022. Number 5. Thomas Knight, also known as Askari Abdullah Muhammad. On April 21, 1975, Knight was sentenced to death for the murders of Sidney and Lillian Gons. On January 20, 1983, Knight was again sentenced to death for fatally stabbing State Corrections Officer Richard Burke with a sharpened spoon on October 12, 1980, at Florida State Prison. Knight had a long history of mental health issues and multiple diagnoses. In 1970, 4 years before the Gans murders, Knight was committed to the Northeast Florida State Hospital in McLenny, where he was first diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at the age of 19. After the stabbing of Officer Burke, Amnesty International noted that Knight was placed in solitary confinement in the particularly harsh conditions of Q Wing in Florida's Stark Prison. A forensic psychologist later testified in the case about the tomb-like conditions of Q Wing, in which Knight was held for 9 years until 1989. Knight was executed on January 7, 2014, via lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. He was the first person to be executed in the United States in 2014. He holds the record for spending the longest amount of time on death row in the United States before being executed. While on death row, Knight converted to Islam and changed his name to Askari Abdullah Muhammad. Number 4. Andrew Brannon. On January 12, 1998, Officer Kyle Dinkheller, a deputy in the Lawrence County, Georgia Sheriff's Office, pulled over Andrew Brannon for speeding. An argument escalated to a shootout, resulting in Brannon murdering Dinkheller. The traffic stop and shootout were captured on a personal video recorder Dinkheller placed on his patrol car dashboard. The recording is widely used for training purposes in U.S. police academies. Brannon was a decorated Vietnam War veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder. A psychologist for the defense said the tragic encounter was likely the result of a flashback to Brannon's time in combat. In 1994, the Department of Veterans Affairs declared Brannon 100% disabled for experiencing depression and bipolar disorder. Brannon's lawyers tried to get his death sentence commuted because he was not criminally responsible for his conviction by reason of insanity. However, at a January 12th hearing, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles voted to deny clemency. Brannon was executed by lethal injection on January 13th, the first person executed in the U.S. in 2015. In his final statement, Brannon addressed Dinkheller's family saying, "I feel like my status was slow torture for the last 15 years. I had to say that with them here. I have to tell the truth. I'm certainly glad to be leaving." Number 3. John Middleton. On July 15, 2014, Judge Catherine Perry stayed the execution of John Middleton less than 24 hours before it was to occur. Perry stated there was substantial evidence that Middleton was insane and ordered a full hearing to investigate his mental health. Middleton was sentenced to death in Missouri in the 1990s for 3 murders related to methamphetamine dealing. The 54-year-old had a lengthy history of abusing the drug, and his mental health severely deteriorated during the 17 years he spent on death row. Fellow inmates indicated in affidavits that Middleton frequently talks to people who are not there and tells stories that could not have any basis in reality. A psychiatrist who had examined Middleton also provided his expert opinion that the prisoner lacks a rational understanding of the reason for the execution and is therefore not competent to be executed due to a diagnosis of delusional disorder, a psychotic mental illness. Despite these doubts, and a new witness who provided Middleton with an alibi, the Federal Appeals Court overturned the stay. Neither the U.S. Supreme Court nor the Missouri Supreme Court would halt the execution. Middleton was executed by lethal injection on July 16, 2014. His last words were, "You are killing an innocent man." Number 2. Donald Grant. In July 2001, while robbing a La Quinta Inn in Oklahoma for $200, Donald Grant shot and killed 2 employees, Brenda McClea and Suzette Smith. Grant confessed to the murders. He told police he wanted the hotel's money to bond his girlfriend out of jail and didn't want to leave any witnesses. Grant was charged with double murder and sentenced to death on January 27, 2022. Mental health advocates expressed concerns about Grant's mental state. Grant was born with his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, which deprived his brain of oxygen for the first 45 seconds of his life. This left him with intellectual disabilities and mental illness. More than 7,000 people signed a petition to halt his execution. The petition stated, "Donald Grant's mental illness and congenital and acquired brain damage was so severe that it took 5 years for Mr. Grant to be stabilized, where he could somewhat assist his attorneys in his defense." The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 4-1 against recommending clemency. Grant requested to be executed by firing squad but was denied. He was executed on January 27, 2022, just a month before the start of a federal lawsuit challenging the lethal injection drugs as an unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment that makes people feel like they're being burned alive. Number 1. Cecil Clayton. In 1996, Clayton shot and killed police officer Christopher Castetter, who was responding to a domestic disturbance between Clayton and his girlfriend. There was no dispute about his guilt, though there was intense debate about whether he should have been protected from the death penalty. Clayton was 74, suffered from dementia, and had an IQ of 71. He was missing part of his brain from an accident he sustained while working at a sawmill in Purdy, Missouri in 1974. The damage had a long-term impact on his character and behavior, with a succession of medical experts chronicling problems ranging from uncontrolled rage to hallucinations and depression. Clayton's attorney, Elizabeth Argyle, commented, "Cecil Clayton had literally a hole in his head. Executing him without a hearing to determine his competency violated the Constitution, Missouri law, and basic human dignity. Mr. Clayton was not a criminal before the Sawmill accident that lodged part of his skull into his brain and required 20% of his frontal lobe to be removed. He was happily married, raising a family, and working hard at his logging business. The world will not be a safer place because Mr. Clayton has been executed. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Clayton's execution was carried out on March 17, 2015.